Hey everyone, this is Mike. Today we're going to be talking about Astrologian in Shadowbringers, the healer that can play nice with both Scholar and White Mage, and if you have two of them in the same party, then they can both take on a different role, because the cool thing about Astrologian is that they have two stances, or sects as they are called in the game, which is the Nocturnal sect, which is a shield stance, and the Diurnal sect, which is a regen stance, and because of that, they can basically be put into any composition. If you're playing with a Scholar, you just go the regen stance. If you're playing with a White Mage, you can go the shield stance to be the mitigative healer in that setup. Now, of course, I do know that if you play Astrologian at a very high level, the shield stance usually loses a lot of its value because of some tools that we have gotten in this expansion, or some things that have changed to some already existing tools, which makes Diurnal usually the preferred stance to play in, and in the current raid tier at least, there is no real need for the Nocturnal shields because of some new tools that we have gotten in this expansion. But in general, if you're new to Astrologian, if you're just getting into the healer role and Astrologian is the first one that you decide to pick up because it starts at level 30, then this is kind of like the general rule that I like to go by. Now, the big mechanic behind Astrologian is their card system. You are the party buffer healer, so to speak. Your personal DPS is fairly low when you compare it to what the other healers can do, but you are buffing the party a whole lot by playing cards on them, as well as by using divination, which is your raid buff that also plays in together with those cards. When it comes down to your healing style, you are very off global cooldown focused. You still have your GCD tools that you can use when it is necessary, like for example your co-healer was to die and you need to pick up the slack from them. You still have some really powerful spammable GCD heals, but you also have a crazy amount of off global cooldown heals that aren't tied to a specific resource. Like for example, if we look at Scholar, they also have a lot of off global cooldown heals, but they're either tied to the fairy system or to the Aetherflow gauge, whereas with Astrologian they're just on their own cooldown and you can use them wherever is necessary, which makes it so that they're very focused on using their off-global cooldowns first, GCDs second, because a lot of the off-global cooldowns are also on a very short cooldown, making it so that you want to be trying to use those as much as possible. So let's start with taking a look at the cards, then we'll look at our DPS abilities, and then we'll go into the rest of our healing kit. So we have 8 different cards available to us, and there is 2 different categories in these cards. We have melee cards and we have ranged cards. If we're looking at the melee cards, they are both destined for our melee DPS as well as our tanks, whereas our ranged cards can be played on the ranged physical, the ranged magical or our casters, and on the healers. Now, of course, usually you're not going to be giving cards to healers or tanks, but say for example you're playing in a dungeon, you were to have 2 ranged in your party and you draw a melee card, whilst both of the ranged already have a card, and you can just play it on the tank or keep it for later because you want to like redraw it or something like that. Now, outside of just having these 2 categories, melee and ranged, we also have 4 different seals. So each category has 4 cards, 4 for the melees, 4 for the ranged, and each of these cards in these categories also will generate a different seal for you. We have the solar seal, the lunar seal, and the celestial seal, and then the 4th one is just going to be no seal. Now, these seals are important for your divination. Your divination is your raid buff. They can only be used when your gauge, because this is on your little card gauge, has 3 seals, and the more unique seals that you have, the bigger the damage buff is going to be that you give to the rest of the party. And that is why you kind of want to try to fish for those unique seals by redrawing your cards and that kind of stuff. You have a draw action, you have a redraw action, and then you can of course play as well. Now, sleeve draw is an ability that makes it so that you draw 1 card, and that card will be guaranteed to have a seal that you don't have yet. So generally what you want to do in your opener is you want to draw a card before you start to pull, wait 30 seconds for your cooldown to be ready again, you pull, you play that card, you draw a new one, make sure that this has a different seal, you play it, use sleeve draw to get to that final seal that you need, play that, and then you can use your divination, a very consistent opener, which has become possible since the latest change to sleeve draw. Now, personally, I do think that sleeve draw has a little bit of a too long of a cooldown, because back in the day we used to draw 3 cards through sleeve draw, I believe, 3 or 4, but I think it's 3. But right now you only draw the 1 card, so it does feel a little bit like the card system has become a lot more simple than it was before. There are still some things you have to pay attention to, like for example those seals, to make sure that your divination is as strong as possible. But with sleeve draw now being very lackluster, yes, it's very useful to guaranteeing you a seal that you don't have yet, but I do feel like you're not drawing enough cards, where that is like the whole mechanic behind Astrologian, is drawing and playing a lot of those cards. So if anything was to change to the card system, I hope that they just make sleeve draw 2 minutes so that it lines up with the 2-minute cooldown of Divination, the raid buff, that it is basically tied together too. So that's kind of the card system. You draw a card, you play them, you have melee cards, you have ranged cards, and then each card also has their own seal. Again, there are 2 cards, one for the melees, one for the ranged, that do not have a seal, and that is because, for example, say you already have 3 seals ready for your next Divination, then you can just give them that seal-less card, because those cards, the Lord and the Lady as they are called, also grant a bigger damage buff. So all of your cards do the same, they all give a damage buff to the person that you are giving it to, but then of course as you play it, you also grant that seal onto your divination gauge. And of course, if you already have all of the seals that you need, or for example, say you already have a solar seal and you drew a card that has a solar seal, you can turn that into a Lord or a Lady to make sure that you don't override that seal on your gauge, so that you have too many seals or something like that, or not enough unique seals for that next divination. Might sound a little bit complicated as I am trying to explain it right here, but when you're just taking a look at the gauge, when you're drawing these cards, everything is pretty obvious as to what you're supposed to do with them. You just need to remember what are the melee cards, what are the ranged cards, and then when it comes down to the seals and that kind of stuff, whenever you draw a card, it will show the seal right on top of there, so you know whether or not you need to redraw it if you already have that one on your divination gauge. So let's move over to the DPS aspect to Astrologian, because this one is fairly simple. We have Malefic, single target skill. Really cool thing about Malefic is that it has a very short cast time, meaning that you can use an off-global cooldown every time that you use Malefic. And seeing how Astrologian is so very off-global cooldown focused with the card system, with a lot of our heals being off-global cooldowns, Malefic is basically just a really great thing to have to allow for one off-global cooldown every time that you use it. Combust, 30-second damage over time, same as all of the other healers. Also instant cast ability, so you can double weave here. And then Gravity is our AoE skill. This one does require a target, so you need to make sure that all of the mobs are clumped up if you want your Astrologian to be able to contribute as much as possible to the AoE damage in dungeons as well. And this one also has a very short cast time, thus allowing you to use off-global cooldowns in between each gravity cast. Now, last but not least, our Earthly Star off-global cooldown heal will also deal damage. I'm just gonna mention it really quickly over here. It does do damage, but in general, I like to just use it for healing purposes. Later on, when you do optimize your Earthly Star timings, you can of course start to use it for DPS as well if you don't need it for the healing, because of just the immense amount of off-global cooldown tools that Astrologian has available to itself. And of course, you still have a co-healer as well, so you can use both of them tools together. And then we have Lightspeed. This isn't necessarily a important cooldown to use as it becomes available anymore, because back in the day this used to also grant you a reduced mana consumption. That part is gone now, so you really only use it if you need movement, because what it does is it will reduce the cast time of all of your spells by 2.5 seconds, meaning that most of your GCDs are gonna be instant cast except for your Resurrection. That one is still going to take some time, but still it will have 2.5 seconds of its cast time removed, which is pretty good if you do need to rest some people. But in general, you're going to be using this when you need the movement, for example during the opener when you need to double weave quite a lot, and that is pretty much that. You don't need to spam it anymore on cooldown just to get the mana reduction, because all of your mana is mainly going to be coming from your cards now. Every time you draw a card, you're granted some mana, and then of course we also still have cheaper heals now in this patch as well. So let's move over to those heals. When it comes down to our GCD heals, we are very similar to a White Mage. We have Benefic and Benefic 2, which are our single target heals. Benefic being the weak single target heal, Benefic 2 being the strong single target heal. But when you're spamming Benefic 1, you have a chance to be granted a guaranteed crit on your Benefic 2. Now in general, you're not really going to be using the normal Benefic, you're mainly going to be using Benefic 2 if you are going to be resorting to one of these two, of course, because we have so many off-global cooldown tools and some other things that we want to be using first. We also have a skill called Aspected Benefic, and this one will change depending on your sect. If you're in Nocturnal sect, this Aspected Benefic will grant a shield to the person that you're using this on. If you are in Diurnal sect, this will grant that person a regen instead. Now, Aspected Benefic does have a heal attached to it as well, so it's not like White Mage's regen where you literally just put the regen on that target. No, Aspected Benefic will do a heal and then the regen on top, or a heal and then the shield on top, depending on the stance that you are in. It's also an instant cast ability, so allows for movement, allows for some off-global cooldowns to be weaved there as well. For AoE, we have Helios and Aspected Helios. Helios is basically just the spammable one, kind of like the Medica from White Mage, whereas Aspected Helios again ties in together with the sect that you are in. It will just do a heal on its own, and then if you're in the shield stance in Nocturnal, it'll also grant a shield to everyone that you healed up, and if you're in Diurnal, it will also grant a regen over time to everyone that you just healed. And those are our GCD healing tools. And then we also still have our off-global cooldown heals. Most of these are on a very short cooldown of 1 minute or lower, and then we also have some that are a little bit of a longer cooldown as well. Starting with Essential Dignity. This is our single target heal that can stack up to 2 times, so if you really need it for a specific part in a fight where you need a lot of healing on that target, you can just stack it up twice, or for example, if you don't need to use it, you can just stack it up for when you do need it. This is also going to get stronger as your target drops lower in HP, so usually what you want to do is let your tank drop a little bit lower than you usually would let them drop before using this skill, because the lower they are, the stronger this skill is going to be. Something that you can also do, but you shouldn't really do it all that much, is you can use a Benefic 2 and instantly weave a Essential Dignity in between. This will clip your GCD, but what it will do is it will basically give you the Essential Dignity heal as if your target was still as low as before you used the Benefic 2. Now this is something that you're basically playing with server ticks. It's also something that you don't really want to be doing all that much, because as I mentioned, you don't want to be using your GCDs all that much because you have so many off-global cooldown abilities. I hit my keyboard right there, which is you might have heard some weird sounds. But yeah, it clips your GCD. You use a Benefic 2, those are 2 things that you don't really want to be doing, but it's just something that you can do. For example, if you go into a dungeon, your tank drops really low and you're like, damn, I really need to use this Benefic 2. You can use the Benefic 2 Essential Dignity right after to just still get that really strong heal, as if that person was still as low as before you used that Benefic. Then we have Synastry. This is a skill that I don't really like all that much. If I wouldn't have gone through the skills real quick before I made this video, I would have probably forgot this thing even existed, because it is fairly useless. What it will do is it will place a buff on a target party member, and when you use a single target GCD heal on someone else, they will get 40% of the heal of that. As I mentioned, you're not going to be using GCD heals all that much, meaning that this isn't really going to be all that useful, and it's also only 40%, so it's not really used all that much. The only fight that I can really think of immediately is maybe Alexander Ultimate, because there are 2 tanks that are usually going to be tanking 2 bosses at the same time. Throw it on one tank whilst you're using a Benefic or something on the other tank, and then it can be useful, but it lost its healing buff that we had back in Stormblood, I believe. It only works on GCD heals, so it's not really all that great. The other skills that we have though are pretty great. So first of all, we have Collective Unconscious. Now this skill has 2 different aspects to it, because you're basically going to be holding up a bubble, and whilst you're holding up the bubble, you're not going to be able to do anything else. And there is a aspect to this skill as when you are holding up the bubble, but there will also be a buff granted to those players that go stand inside your bubble for even as short as just a second. So let's talk about the holding up the bubble first. If you're inside of Nocturnal stance, holding up the bubble will grant everyone a regen over time as long as they are standing inside of the bubble. If you're in Diurnal stance, people will take reduced damage whilst you're inside the bubble. This also works with server ticks, so if you were to flash the skill real quick and immediately cancel it to start doing damage again, this effect will still last for about 3 seconds. Now the second aspect to this skill is that everybody that enters your bubble, even if it's only for a second, they will be granted a buff. If you're in your Diurnal sect, they will be granted a 15-second regen. If you're in the Nocturnal sect, they will be granted a 20-second 10% damage reduction. This is really good because this is a damage reduction that is 10% is pretty alright, but the skill is on a 60-second cooldown, meaning you can have a 33% uptime on this damage reduction buff, which is why I think that Nocturnal Astro is actually pretty good, although most people still prefer Diurnal to heal more because damage reduction, seeing how much mitigation we have in the game at the moment, isn't necessarily needed all that much, but it is still pretty cool. So if you're inside of Nocturnal sect, holding the bubble gives a healing over time effect to everybody that is standing in it, together with a 20-second damage reduction buff, even if the bubble was to go away. Whereas if you're in Diurnal sect, as long as the bubble is open, people inside of it take less damage, and then they will also be granted a 15-second regen effect, again, regardless of how long you hold up the bubble. Moving over to Celestial Opposition. This is just a AoE heal, but on top of that, depending on your stance again, it will get a bonus effect to it. So the heal itself is 200 potency, which is not all that bad. If you're in Diurnal Sect, a regen over time will also be added on top of this heal. If you are in Nocturnal Sect, a shielding ability will be added on top of this heal as well. The regen lasts for 15 seconds, which is definitely not all that bad. And then we have Earthly Star. This is one of those signature Astrologian abilities because it requires a lot of planning for you to do. When you place down the Earthly Star, it will explode after 20 seconds duration, but the cool thing is that after 10 seconds of it being placed down, it'll get stronger, so you can explode it whenever you want. Like, you can place it down, immediately explode it if you need it for the healing, but if you can place it down and leave it there for at least 10 seconds, the healing, as well as the damage that is coming from it, will be stronger, and the healing goes from a 540 potency, which is quite high, to a 720 potency, which is really high for an off-global cooldown skill, especially because this is only on a 1 minute cooldown as well. So you can use this quite often. It just requires a lot of planning to basically find the best parts in each fight where you can use this. And it of course also requires your whole party to actually be standing inside of the star, because that happens quite often as well, where like the Black Mage or a ranged physical DPS will be in Zimbabwe and they're just standing there doing their damage whilst your star is waiting for them to go inside of there before it will explode. So something that you do need your party to be aware of, that they go stand inside of it. Celestial Intersection is one of the new skills that we have gotten in the Shadowbringers expansion, which is a really cool skill. It's on a 30-second cooldown, so you can use this quite often, and it will grant the opposite effect of the stance that you are currently in. So if you're in the regen stance, Celestial Intersection will grant a shield to that person. There's also a healing potency attached to this. So again, it grants a heal, and then on top of that, it still gives you the shield. If you are in Nocturnal Sect, it is still going to give you the heal as well as a regen over time to that person. And again, the regen over time lasts for about 15 seconds. So you can basically have a 50% uptime on this regen effect, which again is quite high. Then Horoscope, again one of the new skills that we have gotten, has two different parts to it. So you apply it, which will apply the Horoscope effect to all of your party members, and then after 10 seconds it will expire, granting everybody the small heal. You can also manually trigger this effect as well if you want to do so. Now, what is really cool about this skill is that you can extend this duration of the Horoscope effect and also make it stronger by using an AoE heal, either a Helios or an Aspected Helios. So the way you best use this skill is either if you don't need it for healing really, you can just use it to top up people, for example, because it's on a 1 minute cooldown, fairly short cooldown. You can just use it for the small heal that it gives. But if there is, for example, a lot of healing necessary, or there are two different raid-wide AoEs happening in quick succession, then you can use Horoscope, use the Helios to heal people up for the second raid-wide goes out, and then you use Horoscope again, or you just let it time out and get double the potency out of it because you used a Helios or an Aspected Helios whilst the initial Horoscope effect was on you. Of course, the original Horoscope lasts for 10 seconds. If you trigger the stronger version, that one only expires 30 seconds later, so there is a little bit of leeway that you have right there. And then last but not least, we have Neutral Sect. This is a really strong ability. It doesn't have damage reduction attached to it like it does for White Mage, for example, but what it does do is it grants you 20% increased healing potency, and it also makes it so that you gain the effects of both Nocturnal as well as Diurnal Sect. So every Aspected Benefic or every Aspected Helios that you're going to be using is going to give you both shields as well as the regen over time, which is quite strong. And if you're inside of your Nocturnal Sect, using for example the Celestial Opposition, which also grants you a shield, this shield will stack together with the Neutral Sect shield as well. And if I'm not mistaken, the Neutral Sect shield will also stack together with the Galvanized shield from Scholar, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Feel free to correct me in the comments down below. So that is pretty much Astrologian, a very off-global cooldown focused healer. If you're looking for a healer but you think White Mage is too boring, you don't like the very healing focused mechanics behind Scholar from the Fairy and the Aether Flow, maybe Astrologian will be something for you, as they're not only going to be focused on healing, but they're also very much so going to be focused on giving out those cards to the rest of the party. So that's gonna be it for me. If I made any mistakes, if there's something else that you would like to add or share your own opinion on Astrologian, then feel free to leave them in the comments down below. But I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.